So thanks for having me. Just a little bit more before I start my formal presentation. It's not that formal. A little bit more about Uncommon Schools. In the fall, we will run actually 16 schools in New York and New Jersey, in Newark, in Brooklyn, and in a couple of cities upstate. So I run the upstate network, upstate part of that operation, but we will have 16 schools. Our kids overwhelmingly live in poverty in the toughest neighborhoods of those cities. On the most recent state assessments, 99% of them, 99-point-something percent of them were proficient in math, and over 90% in English. Mostly through the work of our excellent teachers, we have a track record that we think is successful, and we hope will continue to be successful. But I'm more here to sort of talk about the movement more broadly. So here we go. I'm just going to take you through some data on the charter school movement as it is. We didn't advertise that there would be math. Some people were saying they said there would be no math, but there will be a little bit of math. And I think you'll enjoy it. So this is a scatter plot. And on the x-axis here, I have the percentage of kids living in poverty in any school in New York State. Every dot on the scatter plot is a school in New York State, and every school in New York State, with a few exceptions, is up here. On the y-axis is the percentage of kids in that school proficient on the state test. In this case, it's the 4th grade 2009 New York State assessment. So what does this scatter plot tell you? What you see here is the reason why all of us are in this room, which is poverty correlates to achievement. As you move to the right on the x-axis, the level of achievement goes down. And obviously, one of the major things we're all particularly interested in addressing in education is fixing that. So that's an overview of New York State. And in fact, it gets a little bit more interesting because you can quantify this relationship through a regression by dropping what statisticians would call a line of best fit over the plot. And what this is the line that is the least total distance from all the points on the graph, but to just be a little bit more intuitive about it, what a statistician would tell you is that this is the level of proficiency that you would predict in any school, given its poverty rate in New York State, based on the actual experience of every school in the state. So if you have a school that has 80% poverty, you would expect it to have roughly 63% of its kids proficient on the 4th grade ELA test, based solely on demographics. So now we have a way of looking at school performance that controls for socioeconomic, or for the major factor of socioeconomic status. You could actually add a bunch of other socioeconomic factors on the x-axis. Some people have, particularly at the Charter Schools Institute, and it actually doesn't make much of a difference. Poverty is the driver. So interestingly, now you can tell how any school did compared to what you would predict based on its demographic population. If you're above the line, that means you outperformed. And if you're below the line, that means you underperformed, based exclusively on demographics. And I think anyone running the school would acknowledge that there's a lot more to it than that. So we're looking at broad brushstrokes here. Then it gets a little bit more interesting, because obviously you can do this same exercise for charter schools as well, which are the rose-colored. I didn't think about rose-colored glasses when I put this together, but they're the rose-colored plots on here. So these are the charter schools, and you can also drop a line of regression for them down the plot. So this gives you a very rough way to compare district to charter school performance while controlling for need, which is obviously an overwhelming factor when we talk about the school choice movement in New York State. So on this slide, it at least suggests that there is strong reason to believe that charter schools are at this point, at least on the 4th grade assessment, though having run this data for all the different assessments in New York State, charter schools do have slightly increased performance. In this case, with a school of about 80% poverty, you would expect a charter school to have 5 to 8% more of its kids proficient than a district school dealing with a population of comparable poverty. It's worth noting that while that in the aggregate that's interesting and true, that trend is dwarfed by the difference between high-performing schools, both of the charter and the district variety. And when we talk about the charter school movement, we're talking about a very broad movement in the same way that we are when we talk about district schools. And I think any of us who look at the schools down here, no one is in favor of those schools, or I can't say for no one. I certainly am no more in favor of these schools because they have charter in the name if they're not educating kids. So this is really about what leads to achievement. One last regression. This slide 5, takes us back 5 years. So using a very similar analysis, you'll notice there are a few less dots on the scatter plot. This was an analysis of all the schools in public school districts with charter schools in New York State, so it leaves out rural and suburban districts. You can see that as of 5 years ago, when this plot was made, 2004, fourth grade ELA test, charter schools are actually significantly behind the educational system that they set out to help improve and get part of the improvement of. So this was obviously cause for both concern and urgency. But an economist would argue that a decentralized system under significant performance pressure and accountability pressure would change more quickly with decision-making closer to the front line. And in fact, just to go back to the previous slide, it looks like that is in fact what has happened over the past 5 years. It's worth thinking about then what sorts of things could have caused this relatively dramatic change over the last 5 years. And I guess I thought I'd just talk through a couple of them since they relate to why we're here today. The first one is that schools get wiser more quickly under increased accountability pressure. So I know a school, it's a really fine school. They got a charter early in the charter school movement, and they struggled in their first 2 years. They're wonderful people. They struggled in their first couple of years. They really loved their kids, but they weren't really serious about building a strong school culture. They weren't really serious about using data to drive instruction, which I think any school at the top of the chart does those things. And under intense pressure, they realized that they were going to lose their charter if they didn't do those things. They got religion, they reconciled it to who they wanted to be as a school, and they put into place a really nice data analysis system that they use constantly throughout the year. They changed their culture a little bit, and their scores increased dramatically. So under pressure, schools themselves, even version 1.0 schools, get smarter over time in the aggregate. The sort of economic theory there appears to be bearing out. Second possible cause, version 3.0 schools get to learn from version 2.0 schools who get to learn from version 1.0 schools. In other words, new charter schools come into the market. They know that they're going to be entering this environment of significant pressure, and they know that they have to learn from the experiences of schools that have gone before. So they've been very intentional about doing that, and we'll talk about in a minute about some of the reasons they've been able to. And maybe most interestingly is that markets have matured significantly in the last 5 years. So just to have the data to be able to rationalize the market, to be able to do this analysis and understand who the top performers are, to then go to those schools and visit them and understand what they do and what they have in common. You couldn't have done this scatter plot the year before the 2004 data that I presented to you because it didn't exist. And until 2006, you couldn't have done it with any grade other than fourth grade. So data has allowed us to rationalize markets. When I first started in the charter school sector in Boston in 1997, there was a school that everybody loved. It was highly regarded. It was in the newspaper every other day. It was a magnet for philanthropic funding, and everyone sort of praised it because it seemed wonderful, and the results were actually terrible. And several years later, the data aggregated came out that they were not a very good school. But for a long time, people were trying to replicate this school. And for a long time, people were trying to borrow ideas from this school. And capital was flowing to this school. So one of the great things that's happened is there's just a lot more data to understand success, particularly in the charter school movement, because data is at such a premium. Secondly, capital markets have rationalized, and capital markets are more important in charter schools because you need to get debt. You need to get access to debt on your own. If you need a revolving line of credit, you have to go to a bank. If you need startup capital to pay for your building, because you can't pay for it out of your operating budget, you need to go to philanthropy, or you need to go to some source of capital, which means that that's part of one of the levers of reform for you, or one of the sort of levers of quality for you. So increasingly, as data has gotten more robust in the sector, capital markets have gotten more rationalized. They're not chasing the examples of this weaker school. They're actually going to stronger schools. Reputation markets have also changed. And I think it's easy to underestimate how powerful a driver this is in the charter school sector. It's a very small sector. We all know that we're under incredible pressure. Everyone wants to be the best, and the school that is known for being the best. There's just a different competitive ethos. As this kind of data comes out, it's much clearer who's the best. And when you think about it, what's your incentive as a charter school to be any more than a little bit better than the expectations of your regulator? Almost nothing, right? Once you're above the bar that Jonas can set for you, you have that Jonas Chartock, and his organization, the Charter Schools Institute, or your regulatory oversight entity, if it's SED or the New York City Board of Education. I'm sorry, Jonas, that's not fair to you. Once you're above the threshold that they can a regulatory entity can set a minimum threshold. Once you're above that, what's your incentive to exceed? Very little, unless you care deeply about your reputation. So reputation markets have developed, and I think that's why schools have increasingly been pushing to be A+ as opposed to B+. Finally, supply markets have changed dramatically in the last 5 years. We've been using the expression for this presentation, mom and pop charter schools, but actually we were more like frontier mom and pop charter. We were subsistence mom and pop in the first years of the charter school movement. You had to have the equivalent of a family farm. You had to grow and do everything you needed to run your school yourself because you couldn't outsource anything. You couldn't hire someone to do data analysis for you. You couldn't. There were no ancillary services available in the sector. So you had to do it all on your own. In the last 5 years, a market for services and products has developed that allows you to focus on doing fewer things better. And I think that's one of the other major reasons why you've seen these significant gains in the charter school sector. So are CMOs, quote, stronger than mom and pop charter schools? CMOs being management organizations, mom and pop being independent, autonomously run schools by members of the community. They do appear to have stronger results if you aggregate the effect size of all the scatter plots of all the state tests, like the ones that I showed you before, 5 to 8 times bigger for CMOs over mom and pop schools. But it's hard to define a CMO sometimes. Our loose confederations of schools, CMOs, is the Icon Charter School in New York City, which has had tremendous results and is now replicating a CMO. They have their second school now. At what point do you become a CMO? If you have a support entity, are you a CMO? If you're a for-profit management company, are you a CMO? So it's hard to make these definitions. So this data is challenging to generate. And the last thing I would say is that correlation is not cause, and this is really important to think about. Today's CMOs were yesterday's mom and pop schools. Right now that capital is rational, philanthropies go to great schools and say, why don't you expand? Why don't you replicate? And that's how most CMOs actually start, at least version 2.0 CMOs start. So mom and pops become CMOs, that's rational capital at work. Adam Smith would say combination is the natural order of things. That in a new market, there are a whole bunch of diverse single entity players, and the best people aggregate and get bigger and consolidate. So the last question that I was asked to talk about is where's the value? How are the top 2.0 school, version 2.0 schools smarter? And all of them, not just CMO schools, and not including schools that are CMO run but are not high performing. And how do CMOs add value? A couple of thoughts on that, and I'll just throw out some ideas and then I'll stop talking. One, I think there's just reality. The best schools recognize that there is no 100% solution. I think sorry if there's anyone here from Edison schools. I think when Edison schools, the great big management company that entered the market at the beginning of the charter school sector, came in, I think they believed that a great idea was sufficient. And they had a great model. But they didn't implement particularly well on the ground. We're in the place where, as my colleague Brett Pizer says, there's no 100% solution, there are only 101% solutions. And your obsession with the incremental details of everyday management will make a difference, and I just think that's known throughout the charter school sector now. I think top schools recognize that schools are first and foremost cultures, and that you have a cultural solution you have to make while you're making an academic solution, and you have to understand that you have to change kids' perception of their relationship to schools as soon as they hit the door. And if you don't, you will never be able to set the table for it. It's a necessary but not sufficient step to high academic standards. Number 3, the power of data. I don't think there's a charter school in the sector now that doesn't have an interim assessment program that they use actively because they just can't afford not to. There's such a premium on data that people have had to take their external accountability and internalize it. The last thing I would say that the top schools do is they just have an obsession with and a capacity to not only select talent, but to build talent. There is a real shortage on the labor market of talented people, So we're all competing for the same people, and ultimately the top schools have recognized that what they have to be able to do is train people better. So if you look at the best charter schools, they do 3 weeks of summer training. Our schools dismiss early every Friday, and we do 2 hours of professional development, because our goal is we have to build our teachers instead of buying them on the labor market. How do CMOs add value? Well, I think one thing that we've recognized is a charter school is a really small entity out there by itself, and that there are things that districts do that add incredible value that an independent autonomous charter school can't touch. So what a CMO essentially does is it takes education reform, it tries to do many of the tasks that a district does for a school, which is if you don't have those things, you could potentially be in trouble because otherwise the principal of the school has to do them. It also helps you scale where scale is useful. I think there was an assumption early in the charter school movement that there are efficiencies to scale, and I would actually argue as an operator and former principal of a school that there are disefficiencies of scale on the school level. A bigger school is harder to run, costs more resources. Once you don't know every kid's name in the building, you have to have staff to supervise them. But there are immense efficiencies on the business side, so it allows you to scale up where it's efficient, but not scale up where it's not efficient. The last point about why I think CMOs have been particularly effective. Cultures of internal competition and internal accountability. At every managing director's meeting that I go to, where we compare our schools, I'm put on the line the results of my Rochester school and my Troy school compared to the performance of my peers in New York City and New York, New Jersey. They are tremendously high-performing, capable individuals, and I want to beat them very, very badly. I don't want to be the low person sitting in the room. I'm face-to-face accountable. And that's a very, very strong cultural incentive within a CMO. And I say this with a lot of humility because my first job in the charter school sector, I was the principal of a school in Boston. And I would say that we were very good by the standards of 1997. And we have, instead of going good to great, we went very good to good. And I think the reason that the school went backwards is because it is very, very hard to sustain that intense culture of obsessive excellence unless there is some additional entity doing it, forcing you to think that way, encouraging you and incentivizing you to think that way. As long as just you, the principal, pushing your school, you inevitably regress to the mean. You can't sustain it. You become weak of spirit. So those are some of the ways that I think CMOs have added value, and why I think there's the results back their efficacy in the sector.
Thank you. Baker?
Yep. You don't mind that, Steve.